Hey, Sue, we've got some early birds today. It's nice to
I
see
see
folks
that.
checking
Why
in
so
a little bit
early?
before the top of the hour.
It's always great to see folks funneling in early. It's like getting a good seat,
Get a front
at a
row
movie
seat
theater.
with the
Yes.
other A students. So I am where I usually am when we do our webcast in Brookline, Massachusetts, but you are not in your usual location.
I am not. I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada, where it's very hot. Everyone's like, oh, but it's dry heat.
Uh-huh. You're
Still
not
very
buying it.
hot when it's over, 110.
You're not buying the dry heat, huh?
I am not. Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We are so excited to have you join us and glad that you can be with us today. Before we dive in, drop in the comment section where you're joining us from and also what your favorite summer ice cream flavor is. And I say summer. I personally have a summer only flavor, which is black raspberry or black raspberry Oreo if it's available. So it depends on how
Gosh.
uh,
That's very specific.
I
So
want splurge.
when is the time you stop eating black raspberry ice cream? Is it like when Labor Day rolls around? What's the official end of ice cream season for that flavor?
I only get it out when at ice cream shops because typically I've never seen it in a grocery store, even like a Whole Foods or specialty store. Sometimes people have said, "Oh, but have you tried this place?" So I kind of limit it to me. I end up only having it maybe like 2 times a summer, so kind of keeps the calorie count down. But yeah, let us know what your favorite ice cream flavor is. What's yours, Scott?
For me, the summer flavor probably would be strawberry. And then if I had to have like an off-season flavor, the other flavor we were talking about, I'm heading up to Vermont for a little vacation this weekend. Maple creamies, you probably know about maple creamies.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. So maple flavored soft serve is pretty great when you're bouncing around Vermont to different general stores and ice cream windows.
That's fun. Yeah, my off season is probably American Cone Dreams, the Ben and Jerry's.
Uh-huh. Love it. Yeah, we were just talking about do we go to the Ben and Jerry's factory tour when we're up in Vermont? I don't know if
You
you've been to.
should. I've
Yeah.
been to it. Yeah, it smells like
Yeah.
waffle cone. Everyone, you should go to it if you get a chance to go. But yeah, would love to hear your comments in the comment section. And yeah, so today, I don't know about you, but every time I think about Intel, that sound just rings a bell in my mind. And back in the day, I was so proud to have an Intel chip. So I thought it was so cool, like cutting edge to have an Intel chip in my computer. And so today we're joined by Tim Bodio and Stephen Rich, who are veterans of Intel. They're both managing partners at BRI-Associates and spent almost 2 decades in Intel's new business initiative group, launching really bold ventures and outsmarting the corporate antibodies that can kill innovation. They've been in the trenches, tested the frameworks, and know exactly how to turn disruptive ideas into lasting business wins. So the floor is yours, Rich and Steven. Would love to hear what your ice cream picks are.
Let's see, mine's probably pistachio.
Good choice. Cooking cream for me. Anything Ben and Jerry's. I spent some time up in Vermont with IBM, and so anything from that company is a treat.
Great choices.
All right, should we get started?
Yes.
All right, so we're going to start off with a couple of poll questions here. So the first question is really just trying to get to know who's on the call today. So what describes your role best? Um, so are you a corporate innovation leader where you kind of manage a number of projects for the company and innovation in general? Are you a specific innovation project owner? Are you innovation consultant? Are you innovation software provider or a combination of consulting and software like we are, or something else? All right, so we got quite a mix here coming in.
I'll just pop up for a second to say we always like to get high voter turnout. So if you see the pop-up window, let us know. We've got a little north of 70%. So we can end that and share it out and let you see who's in the audience.
Yeah, so it looks like we got a good mix of both innovation leaders, project owners, and other innovation consultants as well. So that's great. All right, so then we have one more question for you, just to kind of get some of these out of the way quickly. So does your organization bureaucracy negatively impact new business growth or innovation efforts? And if you're in the consulting field, I guess do this on behalf of your clients, right? Do your clients, do you see this with the clients that you work with?
Okay, we're just about at 70. Oh, we surpassed the last poll. So people are getting more engaged as we go. Let me stop and I'll share out the results.
Yeah, well, it's probably a little bit of a audience selection bias given the topic, but yeah, not surprising to see from our experience. You know, this is one of the biggest challenges that companies, especially mature companies, face, especially if they're trying to do innovation that's really sort of more disruptive or diversified, growth oriented type of innovation. So we had many struggles with that at Intel, and we found lots of different options for how to identify and manage those challenges and risks. So we're excited to share some of those with you guys today. All right, so for some of those of you who may not have a lot of experience with Intel, Intel's been around a long time, and while it's struggling today, in its early days, it was quite a pioneer in a lot of corporate innovation and venturing efforts. So it went through its own very significant disruptive transformation early in its life. It started out as primarily a memory company, and then faced a pretty significant existential crisis when that market kind of collapsed and started to commoditize, and was successful in transforming the company to what it's known for today, which is the CPU business. And one of the things that's really interesting about that history there is that it was really a strategy neutral success metric that made that transition possible. So one of the early metrics that Intel used to manage the business was the gross margin per wafer, per silicon wafer that had lots of chips on it. And that's how it would optimize its business managing through the factories, was which product lines had the most gross margin per wafer. And even though the primary business was memory, the profit started to come from the CPU business. And so this was a difficult decision because there kind of was the identity of the company was really wrapped up in memory. But it was this metric that was independent of the current product strategy of the business that actually helped facilitate that transition. And the rest is history, as they say. Also early on, back in 1984, that's actually when I joined Intel, was an early experiment with an internal and highly successful custom governance and autonomous business unit that was called PCEO, the PC Enhancement. So this group built add-in math coprocessors and memory boards and modems and other things that were kind of add-ons to complement the growing PC industry at the time. And it was really run like a separate company inside the organization. It was in a separate building. It had separate, branding, separate channels. It was a new customer, a new channel, and different products from the core business. And those were all new, and those capabilities didn't exist within the core of Intel. So they were created as part of this new company. And so that was really successful and ultimately was reintegrated back into Intel in the 90s. But it was my first experience of that whole idea of an independent and autonomous business group or company within a larger organization. Similar to what it was doing at the same time when Apple first created the Mac. They created the infamous kind of pirate outpost developing the Mac computer relative to the Apple core product line. In the 90s, that retail branding that this internal startup did actually created a lot of interest internally within the broader Intel in the potential to communicate directly with end consumers. And so it was partly contributed to as a catalyst to the Intel Inside program, of really sort of branding the inside ingredients of the computer directly to the end customer, rather than just selling to the PC OEMs. And so that became a very, very successful program. Ad Age at the time called it the most successful and effective cooperative marketing program of all time. And like Sue said at the beginning, the Intel Bong that was kind of part of that, is very memorable. And so that really came to Intel's peak, which was in the around 2000. And at that time, Intel was actually the third most valuable company in the world by market cap. So despite its kind of struggles today, in that period, it was really a world-class leader. And as I said, it was an early innovator in different kinds of practices for new business growth and innovation. And part of that was the creation of Intel Capital, which was the world's first corporate venture capital group, which it formed back in the early 90s. And even today, it's still the second largest corporate venture capital group in the world, only behind Google, with over $5 billion in assets. So that's been a tremendous success for the company and has endured over 30 years. And then in the late 90s, it actually started trying to apply those VC-like methods to internal business growth and innovation, and created the New Business Incubation Group, which is where Stephen and I first met, and were part of that group for many years. And Intel was also an early pioneer in applying those methods and building an internal business incubator for diversified growth. And so we tried many different approaches, learned a lot. There was a significant number of great opportunities and option value that were created out of that incubator, but all of the full potential was not really realized. And so we had a lot of struggles and learnings along the way. That's part of what we'll share with you today. And then we spun out or left Intel to join BRI, or create BRI, in about 8 years ago. And BRI is basically an corporate innovation consulting and software company. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But during the time of this incubator, right, we had done many projects. And so we had hundreds of examples of business ventures that we had funded through different stages of their life within that incubator. And at one point in the around 2009, 2010, we engaged with Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School. And he was infamous for his disruption theory. And one of the questions that we were asking was, could you use his disruption theory to predict the result of business ventures and their probability of success, surviving or success? And so that led to a really interesting engagement of over a year, doing a collaborative research project with them, really looking at sort of the treasure trove of Intel's business incubation history. And the result of that was really documented in the Innovators Manifesto book by Michael Rayner. And so this was really kind of talking about how you could use disruption theory to evaluate and evaluate the risk of opportunities inside the company. And we tried applying some of those methods, but we kind of refined it since then. And we'll kind of talk about that next. But Intel wasn't the only company that was kind of seeing that example. And so at the time, Intel's consulting partner of record was Bain, and they had published the Profit from the Core book. And they were kind of highlighting the focus of, how the further you went away from your core business, the higher the probability that those opportunities would fail, right? And so they kind of describe this method of characterizing the relative adjacency of an opportunity from the core. But the problem is that this is a correlated data set. It doesn't really give any indication of what the causation is, right? So it's pretty clear from Intel's experience and all the data collected from Bain and their experience, right, that doing new things and the further away you are from the core has higher rates of failure. But the critical question is why? And then, what can you do about it? So we spent a lot of our time in the New Business Incubator trying to answer this question. And so it really comes down to what we call company fit, right? So how well does the opportunity align to what the core competencies or capabilities are of the company? And while that sounds really easy, it's actually quite difficult both to diagnose and to do anything about it if you want to try to grow and diversify. And so Bain's answer was always, well, if that risk is higher, then just focus on your core. And so that's great advice if your core business is growing and meeting the growth requirements that you have from your shareholders or your board or whoever. But if you're under a disruptive threat from competitive dynamics in the market, or there's not enough growth coming from that core business, businesses are forced to diversify and look for innovation and growth beyond that core. And so sooner or later, companies face this challenge, right, of how to succeed in growing. And therefore, you want to know how to identify what those risks are and how do I mitigate them. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. So the critical element that we kind of pulled from our engagement with Clay Christensen is his framework called RPP, which stands for Resources, Processes, and Priorities. And resources are really, financial resources, headcount or people, equipment, factories, technology assets, brands. These are all sort of fungible assets that can be arbitrarily redistributed or reallocated for different purposes within the company. The other elements of processes are really sort of the way things get done, right? So they're patterns of interaction, their coordination, communications, policies, et cetera, that happen within the company that keeps it moving. And then also the priorities, which are really, how are embedded in lots of different ways within the company, whether it's reward systems or explicitly stated values and priorities. There's lots of different nuanced ways of how those get presented, but they basically drive the daily behaviors of the members of the organization. And so the challenge here, so this is a great framework for describing how any business operates, right? Everything that they do can fit into one of these three buckets. The problem is that most business decisions end up focusing primarily on resources, which is probably the easiest thing to change and reallocate to different kind of opportunities. But the other challenge, though, is that the processes and priorities tend to get embedded into the culture of the company, right? And they exist for the purposes of making the operation of the core business successful. So they're actually very important, right? They become part of what makes the company good at its core business. But to the extent that what you're trying to do in your innovation requires processes or priorities that are different than those of the core business, those create points of friction. And those can, while independently they may not be significant, the cumulative effect of lots of points of friction create delays or compromises in the business that in cumulative total either make the business unviable or uncompetitive relative to an alternative outside company who's laser focused on just that opportunity. So this is really the core of the framework that helps you evaluate whether a new innovation is aligned to that core or not, and where those points of friction might lie. And there's a link in here to the original article on Harvard Business School that kind of describes this in more detail. And we have a number of kind of case studies and things on our blog, on our website as well. So Stephen, you want to talk a little bit about sort of what it feels like when you're dealing with RPP misalignment?
Yeah, so let's make this a little more tangible. It's a great framework, but what happens in the company is really interesting. So these are examples, real examples that happened at Intel. So our first new business that we were working on required a data scientist. We didn't have a bunch of data scientists at that time in the company that we could pull from, so we went to go hire. And we were immediately hit by a corporate hiring freeze that lasted for 2 quarters. It was scheduled to last for 2 quarters, and it spread across the entire corporation. So after months of trying to convince, an exception for one hire in the context of a company that was at that time about 80,000 employees, it was a tremendous waste of time, and it delayed the project. We eventually worked around it. We worked with a consultant outside of it, but we weren't building the data science competency that we needed for that particular venture. Another example is, Intel is relentless about the quality of its microprocessors. Every processor or chip that it builds has to last a minimum of 7 years. That's the target. And we had identified a business that was going to deal with blockchain, and it needed a piece of silicon that only lasted 1 year. It was going to be tossed after the end of the year because you wanted the more performance the following year. And in order to do that and make the economics work, we couldn't go through the same rigorous process, didn't need to go through the same rigorous process as the main CPUs did in terms of quality, because it just wasn't warranted in this situation. However, trying to get the big corporation to say, okay, it's okay to ship something that doesn't have a 7-year lifespan guaranteed, was a fool's errand. It took us a lot of time to try to get an exception to that. We eventually worked it around it by actually selling it as a service instead of a chip, which was kind of a suboptimal approach to going into the market. The next one was our sales team. Our sales team's compensation was directly tied to silicon. So in the new ventures, we were trying to expand Intel's market footprint by developing software that could be utilized in the industry. And our sales team was motivated to give it away for free if they can make just one more silicon sale. So that's an example of a real RPP misalignment. What they're motivated to do, what their priorities are self-interested and very valuable the way it was set up for the silicon business, but was destructive for anything but the silicon business. And another example of that misalignment with the sales team was the sales team really optimized around going through distributors instead of direct to customers. So when we tried to start a business that would go direct to customers, you can imagine the resistance that we ran into. How many millions of units are you going to sell? What's the size of this new business? And at the beginning, when you're trying to get these exceptions, your new business is tiny. It's all projected revenue. You haven't gone up the J curve yet. And so you really have a hard time getting attention. Now, none of these alone, really ended up killing the venture that was hit by it. But the problem was these were just examples of a few that happened to every single project. And it was that cumulative death by 1,000 cuts that would end up delaying the project or resulting in a compromise in the business model to work around the RPPs that really killed it. And all of the RPPs that you saw in here are actually, very good for the core business. They're not a problem for the core business. They're just not appropriate for the new businesses. So this problem is really hard to diagnose because when you're a manager of a large organization, you don't see these RPP misalignments. When you have positional authority, you can always pick up the phone and resolve a problem. Okay, I want a new sales channel. I want this, so I can reallocate resources. So if you're an innovator in a large corporation, you keep coming back saying, oh, I'm running into this problem. I'm running into that problem. I'm running into a problem with the finance department. It can come off sounding like a whiner when the positional authority can just pick up the phone and do it. So one of the things that we did at Intel is we started to educate our executives on RPP language and misalignments so that we could proactively have those conversations and it didn't come across as whining. And they would understand that, okay, this is the #1 killer of innovation and we need to discuss it and talk about how do we make an environment where these new ventures could take off.
Yeah, and it moves beyond sort of just kind of complaining about bureaucracy, right? Because bureaucracy is really a set of those processes and priorities in play, and those exist for a reason, right? And they're there to optimize and support the priorities of the core business. And so it's not inherently bad. It's only bad when you're trying to do things that require exceptions to that. And so having a framework that really describes that with sort of a neutral terminology, right, that's not finger pointing or blaming, allows you to sort of describe the behavior and why that behavior is happening, and therefore, how do you resolve and mitigate it? So being part of a large company that has a successful, mature core business is really a catch-22 for disruptive or transformational innovation, right? So at one level, you're trying to create value through synergies with that core business. You want to leverage some of those resources or some of those operational assets. That's part of the primary justification for why you're doing it inside the company versus just investing externally in creating equity in another company. But the more you're trying to leverage those core assets, right, the more you're at risk of running into those RPP misalignment friction points. right? So any kind of diversified or transformative growth is going to have this frictional challenge. So one of the things that we did when we first left was actually create a tool, software tool for helping to identify, these types of risks. So Stephen, you want to walk through this one?
Yeah, so let's build this out. So we have a tool inside of GrowthForge that was actually the first tool we created because these problems were the biggest problems we had both at Intel and with the companies that we do consulting with. So on this graph, you're going to see on the horizontal axis is a company's ability to execute something. So do you have the right skills? Do you have the money? Do you have the channels, et cetera? And on the vertical axis is a company's willingness. How much support do you have? How aligned are you with the corporation in terms of the strategy? So let's go ahead and build it out. So if you fall in this upper right-hand quadrant, then it's well aligned with your corporate strategy. You have all the resources, you should do it. It should be incremental innovation for you, and you should do it with your core processes. So use your core team. When you start to go down on the willingness to pursue, that's a place where you want to start to use incubation, right? And that's where I need to get enough data and enough support and enough understanding about a new business and maybe acquire some new skills that I can convince the management team that this is worth executing on. So that's the sweet spot for incubation. On the left in the red is the danger zone. This is where you're trying to build something, a new business in the context of a corporation with a strong RPP misalignment. So an example of this was Intel actually started building a business that was building data centers, and just like AWS. And you can imagine that was full of RPP issues because it was potentially cannibalizing the main core business. It was a more profitable business, but it was not well received by the rest of the Intel, and the antibodies came out and killed it. So the first time, Google or AWS got on the phone and said, "I don't like the fact that you're building data centers," the data centers were ditched. So that was a case of it didn't have the right governance around it to really allow it to succeed. So if you fall in this zone, you really want to think twice about whether or not it's the right company fit. It may be a good business, but it may not be a good business for your company. And then the last region is what we call the shiny object zone. This is where an executive gets really excited about something, everybody piles on, but you don't necessarily have the right fit for the company. And, classic example of this is Intel got into drones. And drones might be close to silicon, but they actually got into drone light shows. So running the light shows was the business. It was a shiny object. The executives got really excited about it. Everybody piled on. And these tend to last about 3 years. The first year, you get the gold credit card. The second year, you're starting to say what my results are going to be. And the third year, hey, the RPP mismatch comes out and those things get shut down. So they're very expensive failure points in those. So in the tool that we've got on GrowthForge, which you can see at growthforge.com, there's a survey that you go through and you answer the questions, and it helps classify where do you fit in this relative to all the research that we have done.
Yeah, and it helps diagnose what elements of your business where the greatest alignment or misalignment points might be. So you can use some of the techniques we're going to talk about next to help mitigate some of those challenges. All right, so let's pause again for another poll question here. So let's kind of get a profile for what are the kind of primary focus of their innovation activities, and this one's a multiple choice. So if you do all of them, select all of them, but try to highlight the ones that you're kind of primarily focused on. Yeah, it's interesting. As the host, we can see sort of the live stuff coming in. I don't know. I don't think it's. I don't know if it's visible to the users or not. But yeah, we're seeing an interesting mix come in here. All right, so yeah, we can see that there's quite a spread, but a lot of the focus is on some of the transformative and more adjacent types of opportunities. So I think the ones that are focused on sort of the internal process innovation and sort of incremental product or service innovation that's close to your core business, you're less likely to run into these challenges, and hopefully that's the case for you. But if your portfolio includes focusing on the Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 stuff, that's where you're going to have the greatest challenges. So let's switch here and now say, what can we do about this, right? That's all great, well and great. We can diagnose now what the causal mechanisms of this failure are, but how do we fix it? Stephen, you want to?
As part of the new businesses initiatives, we were running operations at the time. Jim was a venture decision maker. And we went out and interviewed dozens of companies from across a wide variety of businesses. So P&G, Goodyear Tire, as well as lots of tech companies. You know, we're really looking for what is the answer if you're trying to incubate new businesses in that H2, H3 kind of domain. And what we found, Jim, if you click,
Oh, sorry.
was that success, you know, there was no one size fits all. Success really required, you know, ambidextrous leadership, right? The ability to hold in the mind that I have exploitation work, which I'm working on my core business. At the same time, I need to be doing exploration work where I'm using different metrics and different systems to judge success, as well as custom governance. So depending how far away from the core you are, the core business, you know, the stronger these needs become.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about kind of four key areas. So one is the corporate strategic alignment. Then there's kind of three different levels of kind of custom governance that you have to think about. One is sort of the portfolio itself, then the ventures, and then also how does that governance change over time. So we're going to go through each of those. So the first one is really the corporate innovation portfolio strategy itself has to be aligned and part of that corporate growth strategy. If it's not, there's almost nothing you can do to solve these problems, right? Because the rest of the organization will always focus on those core processes and priorities and that core strategy. So if you're trying to do something that's not directly aligned or part of that strategy, all of the support that you need that needs to be empowered to make some of these exceptions will not be empowered to do so. So our advice here is that if you don't have that support, right, don't try to do innovation beyond process innovation in your core or incremental, supporting incremental innovation, because you just don't have the air cover and support for it. And I saw a couple of comments from Melanie and Joyce in the chat that basically it looks like what they ended up doing, right? And so unless you have alignment with that, then that's the best choice you have, because otherwise you'll probably fail. So, you know, good for you for doing that. I think if you're trying to still drive towards that ambition of driving towards more disruptive growth, then it's really around a discussion with your leadership of your company of how do you make that the exploratory growth an explicit part of that growth strategy. And the rest of the leadership of the company has to have some skin in the game. They have to have accountability for the actions and results that come, so they can support it. And if they don't, then you have almost no chance of ever being successful. So you really need to do the education of that leadership to have the ambidextrous mindset, right? And using the RPP terminology could be a good way to describe in a much more clinical and neutral terms why the exploratory elements of business have to be governed and managed differently and have different expectations on the outcome. And it's not because, you know, you're being just kind of, you know, you don't want to have rigor or accountability or good discipline, right? There's different types of discipline for innovation than there is for execution and operations in your core business. So, you know, some leaders may look at sort of the innovation as wanting to have no discipline because they don't want those core operational metrics or KPIs to be applied. And that shouldn't be the case. There should be absolutely discipline and rigor applied to your innovation method. It's just a different set of metrics. right? And so that's really the discussion you want to have, is how do we define what those metrics should be? How do they support that corporate growth strategy? And how do you make sure that all of the executive leadership is aligned and committed to support that?
And this is where we see, incubators pop up over time in dozens of companies that last for about 3 years and then disappear. Right, it's an all too common tale. And usually it's because they aren't connected back into the corporate strategy. And so you can't get the results that you need fast enough and aligned enough to get attention. And that's really where that 3-year window comes into play. That usually by the end of the third year, they're looking at the financial return and saying, well, I don't see any returns. And that's right at the point where you should be starting to see the beginnings of those new businesses come up. So they're nascent at that point, and usually get killed.
Yeah. So, this was where we ran into the biggest challenges at Intel, and why Intel's incubation efforts ultimately really didn't deliver on the potential that they had. So, we had the venture, the incubation effort survived through multiple CEOs within Intel. I would say most of them had a pretty poor understanding of and kind of ambidextrous leadership or mindset. So you could have a discussion with them about it, and they sort of, acknowledge that kind of exists, but whether they truly internalized it and tried to apply it, that wasn't the case. And they really didn't apply the sort of diversified growth into the core strategy of the company. And in my assessment, right, this is primarily because the board didn't see a need or an opportunity to grow beyond the semiconductor business, right? And so, we had tremendous assets and opportunities that could diversify way beyond that if we kind of looked at the company as a technology company rather than a semiconductor company. But I think the board primarily saw it as a semiconductor manufacturing company and really limited its aspiration just to that. So the ability to kind of grow and diversify beyond that just wasn't within their ambition.
Yeah, and I want to temper something Jim said a little bit. 26 years in the incubator, we're kind of summarizing it all, and it went through lots of different phases. Some phases were more successful than others, and that's where the key learning. And we had lots of businesses that graduated and went on to make an impact within Intel. But relatively to what we could have done is where we're kind of grading this, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely tens of billions of dollars of potential revenue, right, that were not realized. They may have been, single-digit billions, right, or $100 millions of dollars of business opportunity that was created, but the kind of truly transformative growth, that we had the potential to pursue, is really what we missed out on. Okay, so the next phase is really around the portfolio governance, right? So if you're successful in having sort of alignment of doing that innovation and growth, then the next challenge is, how do I structure the governance of the portfolio itself? And a big part of this is just even understanding what a portfolio strategy means, right? And part of the definition of portfolio means that not everything has the same risk profile, and you want to have an intentional mix of risk and return potential, right? So that you have some things that may not be sort of home run kind of transformational hits, but they deliver solid returns, right? And they may do so in a shorter time period, right? Where some of the more transformational things may take a much longer period of time, and they may have a much bigger kind of investment before they kind of create the big returns. But you need to have a mix of those things to have an overall outcome. And the other part of it is, if it's a portfolio, you're expecting that some of those things are going to fail and not succeed, but it's the successes that pay for the cost of those failures, right? So that has to be an explicit strategy in the governance structure around that allows things to fail and has the KPIs and metrics in place to provide the discipline to do that efficiently and well, is really what you need to define within that portfolio strategy itself. And so that's kind of the first layer of sort of insulating the innovation efforts from the rest of the corporate RPPs, is creating an explicit strategy that's aligned with those stakeholders and has consequential impact for those stakeholders, right?
Yeah, and this is where, again, we see, without a portfolio approach, people tend to fall into only the H1 or only the H3 horizon. And the problem with that is, anything that's H3, you're not going to get enough return to give you the runway fast enough to be continuously interesting to the management structure. It's a generalization, but that's what we see most often. If you only do H1, it comes a time where they say, hey, this is something I could have done in my own core team. Why do I need this incubator? So it's that combination that's then tied back into the corporate strategy that allows you to work on both a combination of the short term and the long term, the high risk and the lower risk.
Yeah, and our experience at Intel had kind of mixed results on this one, right? So getting sort of the governance structure of the innovation portfolio strategy for the incubator itself was very successful. So there was clear, sufficient levels of autonomy, dedicated funding, long-term commitment to those, although, there's parts of time where it was more at risk than others. Right. But in general, there was commitment and support for that. And operating the portfolio itself was highly effective and became quite disciplined. The challenge was that, we couldn't get the other stakeholders, other leadership in the organization to really have accountability or any kind of skin in the game for the success of the option value that was created in that portfolio.
Yeah, as Tim said, the inside of the new business incubation, the governance inside of it was outstanding, world-class, I would say. Where it really ran into troubles is it didn't report consistently into ambidextrous leadership. As an example, at one point in time, the new business initiatives was put underneath the head of manufacturing for Intel. And to build factories on the scale of Intel, these things have to work flawlessly day in, day out, no surprises, 100% predictability. So that was the mindset that this individual had when he absorbed our incubator. But as you know, incubators are set up to identify new businesses, right? So that means you're going to fail a lot, you're going to pivot a lot, you're going to learn really fast. In fact, you celebrate those, when we celebrated when we shut down a business, as long as we came to the right conclusion and we did it very efficiently. So you can imagine what happened when, each quarter we would go into the review with this head of manufacturing, and we'd say, oh, we told you we're going left last time, but now we've learned and we're going right. And he would just get red in the face with this. He just could not understand, how we couldn't have predicted, from the beginning. Because in his world, in the manufacturer-oriented world, right, it was an appropriate reaction. He shouldn't get surprises like that when you're running a factory, but when you're doing incubation, exploration, you have to. And I would say that was probably a couple of the bleakest years inside of the incubator that we had going to those meetings. Fortunately, it was recognized that was not a good RPP fit eventually, and the new business initiatives was moved out into a different part of the corporation.
Yeah, so we're talking about sort of creating this alternative governance framework here. So what do we really mean by governance? And a lot of times people just interpret that as creating a separate independent org unit under a different manager. And while that may be part of it, it's much more than that. It's really about sort of a clear charter and what the priorities are. So if you recognize the term priorities as part of that RPP, so the priorities are different for that alternative governance. And the way you measure the success towards that charter and those priorities are different. So the oversight and decision-making may have different processes and different actors that are involved in that decision-making. The talent and skills and the culture of the organization are going to be different, right? You're going to be focused on efficient learning and discovery rather than focusing on efficient execution. And then the structure and being designed for sort of operational flexibility is really key, right? And one of the biggest challenges of a portfolio or incubator strategy where you have this expected fallout, right, of projects failing is how do you staff that, right? When you have new areas of expertise that you need to bring in experts for, like Stephen shared the example earlier about trying to hire an expert data scientist when we're trying to do something that was more machine learning and data science driven analytics. You can't just draw from people that exist in the organization, and if the venture gets shut down, what do you do with them? So you have to have flexible operating capabilities that are different, right? And while some of those things may be very negative in the core business, those are sort of pluses, right, or advantages in how you set up and structure and manage the governance for either the portfolio itself or the individual ventures. But basically what you're trying to do there is look at where are the places from the core business that you can borrow or leverage because they are well aligned with the RPPs of both the portfolio or the venture. What are the capabilities that you need to build because those competencies are core to the success of that project or that entity? And then which things are either immaterial and you should therefore buy them or outsource them to a supplier because they're not competencies that you need, right? Or you need flexibility to get them quickly and you don't have time to build them yourself, right? And then there's a hybrid of this, which is actually where you could potentially just acquire those assets, right? If you can acquire a startup or a small company that has those competencies or capabilities, right? So governance is really about the appropriate balance of the decisions of whether you're going to leverage, build, or outsource or buy different capabilities, and then how you're going to structure all of that. So that's kind of what we mean when we say governance.
And I would highlight measurements are kind of a key canary in the coal mine, right? So at Intel, they had the favorite measurement was 50-60% gross margin. Everything had to be that. Everything had to fit that. And so when you're starting out new businesses, it's impossible to get 50 or 60% gross margin. You're just learning. You're just starting to scale. You don't have the efficiencies. Right. So if you apply that metrics to the incubator, there's no way it can succeed. And we see this in most companies that we deal with. They have a favorite metric that is really how they drive the core business. It might be top line revenue, it might be margin, but they try to apply those to the incubator, right? And they just don't work that way. That's where you need that custom governance.
Yeah, and I call those proxy metrics, right? Because they're really measuring a proxy for something that's more important because they're making assumptions about how the rest of the business model works, right? So for Intel, when Intel was looking at gross margins of 50 or 60%, that was the gross margin of our core microprocessor business. And there was an assumption about how the operating expense side of that worked, right? And what those ratios were. So as long as you were hitting that, then the net result was profitable. But what really mattered was the net income, right? The bottom line profitability. So if you had a 35% gross margin, but your operating expenses were much lower, you could still create just as good or even more operating profit than the core business. But there was that shorthand or proxy metric that was the focus rather than considering the entirety of the business model and the assumptions that implied. Right. So that's a dangerous thing, a habit that companies get into around their core business is creating these proxy metrics for things rather than looking at the totality of the net results or the outcomes. Okay, so then second to last dimension of mitigation is really around having flexibility for the venture specific governance, right? So while a lot of companies will focus on the portfolio strategy and kind of carving out some autonomy and independent governance framework for that, every one of the ventures inside that portfolio also may have very different sets of requirements and RPP requirements, and therefore need different types of governance, especially at different stages in their maturity. So it's really around sort of figuring out what's the appropriate alignment. So for example, creating a silicon or semiconductor product in a new family inside that portfolio may have a lot of potential synergies with Intel's core functional capabilities, and those may be advantages. But as Stephen shared in some of the examples, building a services business that was direct to consumer, right, had a lot of points of friction and therefore needed a very different sort of governance framework than a silicon product inside of the portfolio. So success there really needs have that customer governance at the venture level, and then what we call the fit team to help streamline the interfacing and appropriate leveraging of those core businesses. So at Intel, these were things that we successfully developed within the incubator, and we'll talk about this fit team in a second here.
Yeah, so it's great to say that you should have a custom governance for each one of these ventures, or a set of ones that you use for like ventures, but you can't leave it up to the venture lead to do it. And so my experience when I was a venture lead was that I was interacting with legal, finance, sales, marketing, manufacturing, all the horizontal support groups almost on a weekly basis, right? And I realized that at one time I was, asking for exceptions, or how can I utilize your sales team, or how can I get resources? And I was spending all of my time inward focused. I, rarely was meeting with customers and having the external focus, which is not a recipe for success. So the solution to that was we put in place what we call the functional interface team, or the FIT team. And this was consisted of key leaders of each one of these organizations, that was empowered to make exceptions, that understood the difference between exploitation and exploration, and how the work there differs and is measured differently. So now, as a venture lead, I would meet once a month with this team, get all of the opinions from across all of the different horizontal support groups at one time, and I could shift my focus back to my customers. So it was a godsend. Without it, it was clearly death by a thousand cuts. I just couldn't, as a small team, interface with the size of Intel.
Yeah, and this is a good example of sort of translating that ambidextrous leadership or mindset into a more ambidextrous governance or function at the organizational level, right? So this functional interface team has to have that tops-down support to succeed, because that creates the empowerment and the accountability within these functional teams, right, to be able to support the exceptions when needed and appropriate, right? And so as long as the representatives of these functional organizations understand the difference in the success metrics and the objectives of the exploratory activities from those of operating the core, they can make good judgments and good decisions about where they can support exceptions and not, right? And so that's really critical. And then the other part of it is just like Stephen said, the bandwidth, right? These functional organizations, there's massive amounts of machinery that exists in sort of standardized processes for doing this in the core business, but that can be all consuming for a small venture team. And so just this creates a huge amount of efficiency.
Okay, so the last problem is really about how do you transition? Let's say you've incubated something and now you want to bring it back into the large corporation. And we found that there was a systematic problem here. Most of the businesses over time, again, it's a great generalization, there was lots of success, but most of the businesses over time would graduate, and about 3 years, within 3 years, they would be gone. They would have disappeared. And that was really because the failure mechanism was the receiving organization immediately tried to put the mothership's RPPs in place. So the restrictions, optimize the cost out of it. And this is the worst time to do it. This is when you should be scaling the investment and removing all roadblocks so you can move fast enough to get your position in the marketplace. So we tried graduating things later in time, and that also had a problem, right? As these things got bigger and bigger inside of the incubator, they started to compete with resources of the core businesses. So there was a lot of not invented there in resource conflicts. So the approach that we came up with was what we called the mezzanine approach. And this is where you transition over time with a core management team that's built of both the incubator and the business unit at the same time. And you start to transition the RPPs over slowly, and it gets to a scale large enough that you can then change some of the core RPPs that need to change for the business to be successful. And that's only possible once you've gone through most of the scaling process, because then it's big enough that a business unit cares about it and will make the changes.
That's great, Stephen and Jim. Just a time check, we've got 8 minutes.
Okay.
So I'd love to take some questions from the crowd. So
yeah, we can do a quick wrap up if you want, and then we can transition to questions.
Okay,
or...
yeah. Yep, let's do that.
All right, so I'll summarize the last section real quick. So those are really sort of the core 4 elements required for success. So, you have to evaluate the relative proximity to the core of the venture. You need to be considerate of the stage that the venture is in its maturity. And those all have different governance approaches, right, that we talked about. So we can put all of those together into a framework that really says the governance approach really is dictated by this combination of core adjacency and maturity of the venture. So for core businesses, they go through this core process. For incubated things or adjacent and transformational things, they go through this incubation and potentially into a special business unit before they go into the mature operations. You may have external things that you want to invest in or ultimately acquire and bring back in. Those face the same RPP challenges when you try to integrate an external company that you acquire, right? So this kind of governance framework can support all of these things. And the GrowthForge software is really designed to support this kind of phase in the incubation, right? It has a lot of tools for managing through all these different stages of hypothesis development and validation and portfolio management. But the key thing here is that, the core business is really, when you have these predictable and efficient synergies, right, this is the right process to follow, right? But it's not fast at adapting to change, and it doesn't really work well for disruptive changes in the market. The external approach, right, if you have a fully independent company, that's great, right? They can have their own autonomy and they're very flexible of making decisions that are optimized for that, right? But they're not contributing necessarily to the core revenue of the business. So you really have to explore this adjacent and transformational growth opportunities. And the goal there is really around sort of finding the right balance between the level of autonomy and the governance for the venture versus that of the core. And you have to be really mindful of the fact that that has to change over time to ultimately take advantage of synergies with the core business, right? When you have this quote unquote modified core business where, like Stephen said, the opportunity is big enough to matter that the company wants to make the exceptions on an operational and scaled basis. So in summary, right, RPP misalignment is absolutely the #1 killer of transformative innovation. Resulted in billions of lost opportunity for Intel. Bureaucracy exists for a reason, and most of that's good for the core business, but you won't be successful in changing it, right? Because if you do, that's creating compromises for the core. You shouldn't really try. So you have to build solutions that live with that and mitigate around it where appropriate. The RPP terminology is a good neutral framework for having a language to discuss with management and get stakeholder alignment. Early identification of those RPP misalignment risks is critical, and you can use tools like the BRI's company Fit Canvas or the GrowthForge software to do that. And then finally, the mitigations really require this flexible mindset for these key stakeholders and custom governance at multiple points in transition over the venture lifetime. So we have these two tools. We have this for consulting engagements. We tend to use this company Fit Canvas for evaluating the relative proximity to the core of given ventures and seeing where those risks might be. And then within the GrowthForge software, we have this custom tool within it. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Sorry about that.
Cool.
So anyway, there's a discount available for Innolead members for the GrowthForge software. And then we also have a free trial available if you sign up on the website.
Great, Rich. And Stephen, do you want to show your contact info for folks? Like there's some comments that I think need a longer answer that might not be explained via
Sure, I will
chat response.
reshare that. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. I'm curious, and maybe some of the people in the audience are wondering, like, how have you embedded AI into GrowthForge?
Yeah, so for GrowthForge, AI is both powerful and dangerous. So we've kind of developed a policy where we've integrated AI assets into GrowthForge primarily in 3 ways. One is facilitating efficient discovery and expanded perspectives of inputs into strategy, hypothesis, and analysis. The other area is in sort of synthesizing elements of your strategy in summary for reports and outputs and things like that. And then the other area is really in the form of agents, right, that kind of do background or continuous analysis on your behalf. But our core philosophy is that there's always a human in the loop, right? So we don't sort of move any kind of elements of developing or changing your strategy or recording the evaluation of your strategy based on the AI inputs without the human or the user making the final decision or judgment of how that's applied in the modeling.
Great. Just looking at the chat and seeing if anyone has a question they would like to ask, please put that in the chat.
Yeah, there's a question about
the other aspect of GrowthForge. It's the RPP is just one of about 18 tools that are inside of that. But the the philosophy there is if using just AI as a chat mechanism to do your strategy has an issue of it doesn't really help you put all of the components that AI is generating into the framework. And that's really what Growth Forge is about. It's a strategy framework, both at the project and portfolio levels, and it uses AI to help populate the framework.
Jim or Stephen, Valentine had asked us in the chat, and maybe we've got a minute left if you want to do a really quick answer to this. Is there an approach to finding innovation chains that span horizon 1, 2, and 3 in order to minimize long-term failure risk while increasing both short-term ROI and likelihood of long-term disruption?
Yeah, so I think all of the things that we talked about as those critical success criteria still apply, right? So you still have to have that core alignment, right, with the strategy, but having a portfolio strategy that has an intelligent or intentional mix of sort of that near-term and long-term results, so that you're balancing the investment to deliver more kind of base hit kind of results on a short-term basis, while you're investing in some of those longer-term, more kind of home run, grand slam type of potential results, right? And part of the alignment with the leadership is setting an appropriate expectation about both the timeline and the investment required relative to the scale that's getting returned. And that's actually one of the tools we have in Growth Forge, is a portfolio modeling tool that helps you model different survival rates of different risk profiles to set the appropriate expectations, right, of the budget required to get a certain level of return in a given time frame.
Wonderful. Well, that's all the time we have today, folks. Thank you so much to Jim and Stephen for sharing your decades of experience inside the trenches of Intel. We've got amazing events at Innolead.com, and check out Impact this year in Boston, October 20th to 22nd. Reach out to Jim and Stephen. Their contact info is here on the screen, and we will see you next time. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.